Wherever you're listening in the world, thank you for tuning into this special October 7th episode of IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, and it's been 1 year since Hamas brutally attacked Israel and savagely murdered 1,200 innocents, took 251 hostages, and destroyed communities. It's also 1 year since Hezbollah has been relentlessly firing rockets at Israel's north. We remember the souls of all those murdered on October 7th. We remember the hostages murdered, those still in captivity, and those released who are dealing with mental and physical scars. We remember the brave IDF soldiers who paid the ultimate price for defending the state of Israel, and we pray for the speedy recovery of those soldiers wounded in battle. We send strength to the tens of thousands of Israelis displaced by the war, both in the north and in communities bordering Gaza. And at the same time, we give thanks, of course, to the IDF and to Israel's allies around the globe who have stood in solidarity with the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And we, of course, salute the people of Israel for their resilience. Well, to provide perspective to this last year and to recent developments in Israel's fight against Iran's proxies, we are honored once again to have Jonathan Schanzer join us on the program. An old friend now of IsraelCast, Jonathan is Senior Vice President for Research at the FDD, that's the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's also on the leadership team of FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power. Previously, Jonathan worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He has held previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. He's a prolific speaker, has penned countless articles, and has written 4 important books on the region, including Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. If you haven't read it yet, you must add it to your reading list. And on top of all of that, Jonathan is the host of one of my go-to podcasts. It's the FDD Morning Brief. And if you don't subscribe to it yet, I urge you to. You can listen to it wherever you get your podcasts. And with that, Jonathan, we welcome you back to IsraelCast. You are actually our first guest right after the October 7th attack. So it's really fitting that you're joining us 1 year on. And as we reflect on the last 12 months, what has surprised you the most, Jonathan?
Well, first of all, great to be with you
Mhm.
again, Stephen. Really appreciate this podcast that you do. So thank you. The surprise for me is the way in which Israel, I think, was surprised in the beginning.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, the complete and utter lack of intelligence and the failure to predict what happened. The failure to mobilize militarily on that day itself. I mean, it took hours for the Israelis just to get a handle on that Hamas incursion. And then what happened after, I think maybe was somewhat predictable that Israel was going to be stuck in something of a slog in Gaza. But I do think it was surprising that it actually wasn't the Israelis and their military formations or the intelligence that slowed them down, but that it was in fact the United States that slowed down the Israelis. That they had actually done some pretty quick work with Hamas in the north of the Gaza Strip, the center of the Gaza Strip. When they arrived at the gates of Rafah, that southernmost town in Israel, it was the United States government that told them that they had to stop fighting for the entire month of Ramadan. And so they did. And then April came around, and we began to hear warnings from the Biden administration about a possible humanitarian crisis. And that slowed the Israelis down for yet another 2+ months. It was only in June, I believe, that the Israelis really started to move into Rafah and to begin to, I think, finally end the hard fighting. I think there's still going to be some fighting left in Gaza, but I think it's going to really be more along the lines of an insurgency as opposed to the sort of pitched battles that we've watched over the last year. But I think maybe the biggest surprise for me has been that Israel has been fighting a war that runs entirely counter to its own military doctrine. Israel always fights fast wars on the enemy's turf. And what we're watching right now is a long war, 1 year and counting. And we have seen, large swaths of Israel become uninhabitable, fighting that has taken place on Israel's side of the border. This means that Israel's not fighting in its comfort zone. Israel's actually fighting a seven-front war waged by Iran and its proxies, and it is a war of attrition at this point. And that is just absolutely not something that I would have expected to see on October 6th. But this may be Israel's reality for many more months
Yeah, because
as we look to, yeah.
yeah, because I was going to ask you, how long do you think this is going to go on for?
Well, a lot of it really just depends on the contours of the battle with Iran itself. I mean, just to sort of zoom out, I think as I said, the hard fighting with Hamas is largely finished. You're still going to see operations in Gaza where the IDF thrusts in and thrusts out, and that's just, I think, kind of what's happening in the West Bank and has been happening there for quite some time. It's sort of an uncomfortable normal. Um, Hezbollah, after a very exciting month of September, is eviscerated. The Israelis with the pager attacks and the walkie-talkies and the targeted strikes and the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, 75% of Hezbollah's top leadership is just gone, wiped out in the course of a month. A lot of their top fighters and actually some of their munitions have also been destroyed. I still think there's going to be some tough fighting, but if Israel's allowed to fight Hezbollah in isolation, I think they can make relatively quick work. They have better intelligence in Lebanon. They have better capabilities that they put in place for Lebanon. It's really, they invested a lot more in that northern arena than they invested in the south, and we can really see the difference already. But I think the big question is, we've seen obviously some pretty heavy exchanges between Israel and Iran. The first one being in April, and then of course we had that very dramatic attack on October 1st, where Iran fired 181 ballistic missiles at Israel. If this becomes the new normal with large salvos and airstrikes, every few weeks or even once a month, that could extend for quite some time. That's yet another front in this war of attrition that I think Israel would rather not have, but it may be where we're going.
Yeah, we're going to talk in particular about Iran in just a moment. And we should share at this point, Jonathan, with our listeners that we're recording this on Wednesday, the 2nd of October. It's being released on the 7th of October, which is on Monday, to tie in again with the anniversary of that very savage attack. So the world can do 12,000 somersaults from now until then. So we just want to alert our listeners indeed to that. Going back, though, to this notion of how much Hezbollah has been degraded and how much Hamas has been degraded, can you talk a little bit more in depth about that? Because I know many people say that it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. So you destroy some of the terrorists, but new terrorists are going to come up. But if you destroy this whole leadership level that has been in power, for example, for 20, 30 years and so on, then certainly that has a great impact on the organization. So if you can just address that a little bit, Jonathan.
Sure. Well, I mean, with Hamas, the group launched October 7th with a set of leadership that had been in their seats for decades. And over the course of the last year, Israel took out a guy by the name of Salah Harori. That was in early January. That was the first major decapitation. He was responsible for the triple homicide of those three teens in the West Bank in 2014, if you remember that. He also was bragging very shortly after 10/7 about what Hamas had accomplished. So the Israelis dispatched with him. Then they went after the deputy commander of Hamas, a guy by the name of Marwan Issa. That was in March. Then after that, they took out the head of the military command, a guy by the name of Mohammed Deif, who had really transformed Hamas into a much more lethal fighting force over the course of several decades. And then, of course, you had Ismail Haniyeh taken out in the heart of downtown Tehran. This was the longtime political chief of Hamas. But I think you have to also look at the fighting force that Hamas began with. It was about 30,000 fighters. Israel has killed roughly 20,000 of them. They have injured another 5 to 7,000. They have arrested another I don't know, 3 or 4,000. That actually exceeds that 30,000 number that they started with. So what that actually accounts for is that Hamas has gone out and recruited additional fighters, or maybe you have some people that kind of joined their ranks from other terrorist groups, the Fatah Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades or Islamic Jihad. But the bottom line is the Israelis have absolutely thinned out Hamas's ranks. The sort of the way that we talk about it now is that, yeah, you're always going to have guys in tracksuits jumping out of civilian infrastructure with an AK-47 or an RPG trying to take out Israeli soldiers that are operating in this area. But, I mean, the tunnels have been destroyed. The above ground infrastructure that Hamas was operating from has just been flattened. It's very hard to imagine this group coming back in any reasonable way. It'll take 10 years for Hamas to rebuild. And so again, I don't want to suggest that it's just, easy street from now on in Gaza, but I think the threat, that strategic threat that Hamas posed just doesn't exist any longer. So then you move north, and north is interesting because I got to say, from the moment that this war began, I couldn't sleep because I was thinking about what a war with Hezbollah would look like. Because this is a terrorist organization with 200,000 rockets when October 7th happened, including precision-guided munitions, including rumored chemical weapons. We know that there are underwater drones, a fleet of aerial UAVs, just a real formidable force, an army that is trained alongside Russia and Iran. Their special forces have been trained to conquer parts of northern Israel. When Israelis talk about Hezbollah, they talk about it as being equal in strength to a mid-sized European army. So think like the Czech Republic, like a formidable military. And so I was just really very apprehensive about a war, a northern front. As you probably know, Hezbollah's fired something like 8,000 rockets at Israel since October 8th. It was inevitable that Israel would have to engage with Hezbollah in a serious way, not just the tit for tat fighting that we've seen over the course of the last year. And then, we had this very eventful September where, it begins with the killing of this guy, Fuad Shukr, who was one of the guys responsible for the 1983 U.S. embassy bombing in Beirut, or rather the Marine barracks bombing. And then, we had that amazing operation carried out by the Mossad, the taking out of a lot of their top fighters and commanders with the beepers that exploded.
That was like
And
out
in
of a
June,
spy movie, wasn't it?
it was, and it was a capability that was actually, I think the Israelis wanted to keep it. It was disrupted because somebody apparently, and I'm not clear on exactly how it happened, but either a Hezbollah guy took a screwdriver to his beeper and began to realize that something didn't look right, or maybe the beeper manufacturer was about to upgrade the software that might have negated the ability to carry out the attack. So the Israelis pulled the trigger, so to speak, on the beeper operation. That was followed up quickly by a walkie-talkie operation that exploded in the same way, killed dozens of Hezbollah fighters, castrated some, blinded others, and laid out a bunch that were just, it's going to take some time for them to recuperate. And then we began to see other decapitation strikes, with the big one, of course, being just a few days, I guess about a week and a half before October 7th, where they took out the leader of 32 years, Hassan Nasrallah, who really was, I mean, synonymous with the group itself. You become an icon within the Iranian axis. The group is in utter disarray, and on October 1st, the Israelis began ground operations in southern Lebanon to destroy some of the underground infrastructure they had there. The group has just been reeling. And it's hard to imagine that the Israelis are going to take their foot off the neck to allow them to get up off the mat. I suspect the Israelis are going to do whatever they can to press even harder to ultimately ensure that this group meets the same fate as Hamas.
And so that begs the question about the day after, the so-called day after in Gaza. And people have said, well, it needs to be demilitarized and de-radicalized, like what we did in Japan and Germany after World War II. For me, it's a very different dynamic, though, and I'm wondering if you can talk to that.
Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing that I think I feel like I just need to get off my chest is this idea that we've heard, or
Mhm,
this notion that has been circulating in foreign policy circles here in the swamp where I live, where people say you can't defeat Hamas because it's an idea.
mhm,
Um, I fully disagree. I mean, when I look around right now at like Al Qaeda or ISIS, I mean, maybe the idea is not completely destroyed, but look at the progress that we made in eviscerating these ideological movements. They're a shell of themselves, and it's because the United States engaged in a full-throated battle against them. Yes, trying to defeat their ideology, but also taking out their top people. Ideologies don't live very long if they don't have effective champions. And so I do believe that Hamas is significantly weakened. I think there is a way to really erode confidence in the ideology of the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah and the Shiite axis that they support. But you know, when we talk about the day after specifically in Gaza, I've seen some interesting plans. You know, where they split Gaza up into four sectors, and each sector has a municipal center. So, like, you know, Jabalia, Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah, if you've been watching the map over over the course of this year. So, sort of north, north central, south central, and south. And then within each of those municipal structures, they're supposed to stand up governments that would include hospitals, schools, police, and all the municipal services that one might need. And then there would be patrons for each of these sectors. So the United States, the European Union, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Um, no one is exactly rushing to fill those roles right now in the international community. And you can imagine why.
yeah, I was just
Gaza's
say,
kind of a
wonder
tough
why.
place.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a tough, not exactly the kind of place that you think about for a Club Med vacation. Um,
not yet.
but not yet. But I mean, I think the idea, if it can be done, is to try to turn Gaza into Singapore, to make it pristine, to make it well built, to make it devoid of radical elements. That's going to require the Israelis to maintain a security presence, which of course could attract additional violence.
Mhm,
But the key here, I think, is really securing Arab partners, finding, Saudis and Emiratis, finding these governments that may want to contribute and to try to build a more peaceful, more stable Middle East. Iran filled the void in Gaza after
mhm,
2006 when there was an election that brought Hamas to power. Iran took over as the financial patron, which turned the Gaza Strip into, it reminded me at one point of like Taliban ruled Afghanistan. And that's obviously no way to try to rebuild the Middle East. So I think that if they stick to a plan, and look, I'm sure the plans are changing all the time, just as the news is, but if you find the right patrons and you have the right plan and everybody sticks to it, you could really remove Hamas and hopefully rebuild Gaza. And I'll just say this, the last word on the day after. There is room to be optimistic. I don't want to be too, sort of rosy about all of this, but the Palestinian population is among the most educated. Because they have had a lot of exposure to the diaspora, they know what living in a democracy is like. They know what a free market economy is. They've studied in some of the top universities in the United States and in Europe and beyond. And then when they come back from the diaspora and they live in Gaza, yeah, they get radicalized, but they don't forget the fact that there is a different kind of world out there if only their leaders would let them build it. And I think that's one reason to be somewhat optimistic about what happens. But let's be clear, I think we're going to have a couple of tough years ahead of us in terms of the rebuilding and the re-envisioning of
mhm.
Palestinian society.
Jonathan, one other point before we move on to what's been going on the last 24, 48 hours, Hezbollah in Iran. I want to ask you about the hostages. I mean, as a layman, it seems that negotiations are stalled. I'm sure things are going on behind the scenes. Can you just shed any light on that?
I have to say I am I think a rare bird in my field. I have refused to allow myself to watch the original violent footage of what happened on 10/7. I have not allowed myself to get pulled into that world. The way I saw my job was that I needed to be looking at this war, and I knew it was going to be a multi-front war from very early on. I really wanted to look at it as an analyst and not someone who's been to Israel, loves Israeli culture, loves the language, loves the food, loves all of it, right? I didn't want to get pulled into this sort of nightmare that I think a lot of people have pulled themselves into. And I don't blame them, right? I mean, it was horrific. It
Hmm.
was reality. People needed to see it. I didn't want to get caught up in the hostage issue, and I'll tell you why. Because I think the Israeli war aim in Gaza is twofold. And one, it's to defeat Hamas, and the other is to release the hostages. And I see those two war aims as in conflict with each other. And I think the Israelis had to know this when they laid out those war aims, that you want to get back all the hostages. It probably means that you have to capitulate to Hamas's demands. It means that you have to be
Hmm.
more flexible than you're willing to be, and perhaps let Hamas live to fight another day. And I think the Israeli government very quickly began to understand that. And so what they've done is they've fought to try to get the hostages out through gritty operations. I mean, really amazing stuff when we've seen some of these hostages returned through just the sheer fighting force of the IDF. Um, but there are a bunch of hostages that Israel can't get to, some of whom are actually surrounding Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of 10/7. He's using them as human
Yeah.
shields, and the Israelis have reportedly had opportunities to take him out, but if they did, they might have taken out a dozen or a dozen and a half Israeli hostages. What we hear now is that there's, I think, 101, as of October 2nd, I believe there are 101 hostages still being held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I saw reports from the Israeli government that they believe that half of them are dead, which is not surprising. I mean, this is a brutal terrorist organization who's using these people as pawns. I ask, it's an open-ended question whether at this point, as Hamas is on its back foot, possibly, about to be extinguished, whether you want to let Hamas get up, whether you want to make a deal that allows them to live when there are 10 million Israelis that the government has vowed to protect. And in the midst of a seventh front war where one front may actually now be neutralized. Do you want to add a seventh front when there's only six? These are the sorts of brutal questions that make me very happy that I was never elected prime minister of Israel. It's just I mean, it's a brutal thing. You've got to be thinking about how to protect the world's only Jewish state on the one hand, while also trying to save the lives of innocents who were taken by terrorists. And of course, as we know, in Judaism, they say that saving the life of one is like saving an entire world. Each one of these people is an entire world in the eyes of the Israelis, in the eyes of the Jewish community. But can you forsake them for the broader war effort, or do you need to save them despite the war effort? These are the sorts of questions that I can't even imagine what it's like being Benjamin Netanyahu. And actually, worse than that, I can't even imagine what it's like being one of the members of these hostage families. I've interviewed two of them, and it's utterly heartbreaking. And I feel for them. I feel for the people of Israel. I feel for all of us who've been so invested in this terrible ordeal that just seems to go on without end.
Indeed. And we just pray for their speedy release and for their well-being. That's about all we can really do, I think, at this end, truly. Well, let's move on, Jonathan, then, and talk about Iran and talk about events over the last 24, 48 hours, what's been going on. There are two failures that Iran has under their belt of trying to create great destruction, cause great destruction in Israel in April when they sent the missiles flying, and then just yesterday when they sent the missiles flying as well. And I'm wondering, what message then do you think that sends to the Iranian leadership and the Iranian people when they see these two massive, massive failed events?
Yeah, I mean, look, the April 13th event was I think a greater failure than the October 1st event. I think we need to sort of unpack this. On April 13th, they sent 300 or 400 different projectiles at Israel. I think 8 got through. And the ones that got through did very little damage. And it was quite a show that the Israelis put on in terms of their three-tiered missile defense. Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow. They are, the short, medium, and long-term rocket or missile defense systems. They performed magnificently. But the Saudis got in the act, the Jordanians got in the act, the U.S., CENTCOM got in the act, as well as British planes out of Larnaca, which I did not have on my bingo card. They also shot down a handful. It was quite an international display. And I think, Iran walked away frustrated. However, the Iranians also learned, right? Every time we see a salvo like this, they're able to track the projectiles that they fire. They can see how they perform. They are able to get their height, their speed, their distance. And in other words, they can track it all the way toward impact. And what I think we're seeing as of October 2nd, again, we're recording this before October 7th, so it'll be a couple days late, but the Israelis were being very cagey about what was hit, how close some of those rockets came to hitting things. There was, I saw some video online of one rocket that was, that landed maybe a football field away from the Mossad headquarters. That's got to be an eye opener for the Israelis that it got through and that it landed that close. So I would say that, again, if we get into this sort of slog, right, where both sides occasionally launch rockets or, fire missiles at each other, or, Israelis carry out airstrikes. My sense is that Iran's probably going to get better over time. So, those that have been, kind of spiking the football in the end zone, I caution
Mm-hmm.
against getting too euphoric. And I think the Israelis, I've been hearing that on Israeli TV too, that the euphoria needs to be kept in check. I do think that it's actually remarkable to watch the Israeli public as they just defiantly thumb their nose at the Iranians, saying we're still here. It's actually amazing. In maybe the last week or so of September, as the Israelis started kind of really showing what they were capable of, knocking out Hezbollah assets and then, fending off another Iranian attack. Every interview that I've seen on TV, I've heard on radio, the Israelis when they sign off, they say Am Yisrael Chai, right? The people of Israel live. And this is like this defiant statement that they're all using right now to just sort of say, we're not going anywhere. And I think that message is a really important one to Iran, even if the regime is making a modicum of progress in their missile, their ballistic missile program.
And Jonathan, when those missiles were being lobbed at Israel yesterday, people were still getting married. I don't know if you saw video footage of that.
I did. And that's the Israeli spirit, right? I mean,
Yes,
that they all know that they're living in a place where they are still, under fire, that they're still hated.
right.
I think, Israel has come a long way with the normalization agreements that they signed, several years back, the peace agreements that have somehow endured. I think they're under strain with Egypt and Jordan.
Mhm.
There's still changes that are happening. I'll just tell you this, though, that, first, the spirit of the Israeli people, it's defiant, and they're gonna be dancing the first song at their wedding in a bomb shelter. I saw
Which
one of
they've
those
done,
videos.
yes.
Exactly. I mean, really amazing stuff. But I will also say this, that if and when, or just let's say when Israel comes out of this hole and is able to somehow get the better of Iran and the 6, different jurisdictions where proxies are firing on them, almost daily. If they're able to come out, or when they're able to come out of this in one piece and actually, prevail, that I think could be the moment that we see a flood of additional normalization agreements. Because what the Arab states want from Israel is Israel's strength. They don't need, more lawyers. I mean, they don't mind the tech. But really what they want is they want the ingenuity, the intelligence, the cunning on the battlefield that Israel has exhibited. I think that 10/7 did a lot of damage to Israel's brand in the Arab world.
Hmm.
When they saw blood on the ground, when they saw the destruction, when they saw that Hamas, a ragtag, not particularly well-funded or well-armed group, was able to somehow penetrate the fortress of Israel and really do a lot of damage. I think you had a lot of countries that began to wonder, is this really the powerful partner that we signed up for? And I think now we're watching a stunning change in momentum in September. The attacks that Israel launched against Hezbollah, the near end of Hamas as we see it, the defiance in the face of 181 ballistic missiles launched by Iran. I think we're beginning to see that Israel, to quote Austin Powers, has found its mojo.
Yes.
Right, right. And that mojo is going to be crucial for Israel to take into the next phase of this battle, but then also to take back to the Arabs when this is done and say, you wanted a strong partner, here we are.
And apropos of that, I heard philosopher Mika Goodman on another podcast, and he talked about the difficulty that Israel has. And I'd love you to weigh in on this, that on the one hand, it has to be seen as a Western liberal democracy for Europe and for North America and for some of its allies around the world. Yet it also has to be feared by its neighbors, and it almost has to be seen as a little bit crazy by its neighbors and unpredictable. And those two are really fighting each other. And so the West really doesn't understand that. Can you just weigh in on
No,
that, Jonathan?
I totally agree with Mika's thesis. I mean, I'd put it maybe a slightly different way. I think the Israelis need to seem a little unhinged,
Hmm.
but just they need to win, right? I mean, there's a book by a guy named Lee Smith. Maybe you've seen his stuff, but he talks about the idea of the strong horse in the Middle East.
Hmm.
That Arab states want to follow, or Muslim populations want to follow the strong leader.
Yeah.
They want to know that they're behind people that will be able to protect
Hmm.
them. And so the Israelis need to be the strong horse in this scenario. And yet, what they also have to do is fight according to Western rules of warfare. They have to cut down on the collateral damage. And a lot of this comes down to like, for example, the Saudis, right? They're watching all of this, and I think they have no love for Hamas. They have no love for Iran. They want Israel to win, but at the same time, what they don't want to see is a lot of bodies, right? And that is this, I think, again, it dovetails nicely with what Mika has tried to describe. Israel is like it's a tightrope walk right now.
Yes.
They need to win decisively without that major collateral damage where Arabs and Muslims are seen to be suffering needlessly. Can we say that happened in Gaza? Well, there was a lot of destruction, but the civilian to militant casualty count is actually said to be roughly 2 to 1, which is lower than most wars that America has fought, maybe every war that America has fought for that matter. But the numbers are still too high for the Arab world. How does that look now as Israel faces, another war in Lebanon, or
Hmm.
perhaps the need to bomb the Islamic Republic in Iran? And could there be collateral damage there? This is the tightrope walk that the Israelis are now forced to try to execute, and it's not easy.
Right. I heard you interview your colleague, Ben Taleblu, and he said something that I'd love you to address, this normalization of Iran attacking other nuclear powers and living to tell the tale. And when I heard that, that was like, the light bulb just went on in my head.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was an attack that the Iranians carried out in, I think it was 2023. I think it was just last year, where the Iranians got hit by some group in Pakistan, and the Iranians fired back again at a nuclear power. That was kind of a big moment, right? That they would do this, and
Into another Muslim country.
Exactly. And it seemed very out of character. It seemed like a risk to take with a country like Pakistan doesn't suffer that kind of stuff lightly. But then, of course, now we've seen two attacks against Israel. This is, of course, an undeclared nuclear power, but nevertheless, one that everybody knows is nuclear. The regime is taking some real risks, and they're doing it, by the way. I mean, it used to be that, that they fought their enemies to the last Arab, right? They used Hezbollah, they used Hamas, they used Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, right? That they would sit comfortably at home while funding and arming and training these Arab fighters. And now we're seeing an Islamic Republic that is willing to do some of this themselves. So there is a sort of an emboldenment that we're seeing on the part of this regime that has me concerned. Because the more aggressive Iran gets, the more the rest of the region cowers. And by the way, the more the United States appears to cower. Now, look, as of October 2nd, the United States is weighing its options and may, in fact, respond to the October 1st attack. And that would be interesting. But I will just tell you that the U.S. has sustained a lot of strikes over the course of the last year from Iran's proxies. I'm talking about the Houthis, but also the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. We lost 3 servicemen in Jordan earlier this year. There have been like 175 attacks, according to my colleague Brad Bowman, who runs our Center on Military and Political Power. And by his count, the United States has responded, and feebly at that, only 11 times to those 175 strikes. So in other words, what Iran is now beginning to feel is that they can get away with a lot more, that the region is afraid of conflict, that America is afraid of conflict. Even the Pakistanis don't seem to be particularly interested in fighting with them. And so they are emboldened by what they see. They're feeling that that they can ramp things up further. And that's something that needs to be stopped here. And I think that is what Israel aims to do. That's what we call reestablishing deterrence.
Jonathan, just one or two other points because I'm super mindful of the clock in your time. Israel knew where Hania was, and they got him. They knew where Nasrallah was, and they got him. I'd imagine that they know where the senior Iranian leadership is.
I think so.
And
Yeah.
And you know where I'm going with that.
Yeah, I do. And I would just say this, as the Israelis weigh their targets, this is how I assess what they're looking at right now. They have kind of a green light at this point to attack in response to the October 1st, 181 ballistic missiles. So the first thing that they're likely to do is to take out Iranian intelligence structures. I think that's kind of a no-brainer. I think they will target the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, some of their core facilities. The IRGC, as you know, they have the Quds Force, and the Quds Force is kind of the terrorist sponsoring arm of Iran, right? That they provide the weapons and the cash and the indoctrination and the training and all the things that Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and all the others are using. And so I expect the IRGC to be taken out. I think there's going to be a real temptation to hit oil facilities, right? Energy depots. This would rob the regime of their ability to fill their coffers. But you got to remember, there's one downside to that. It would probably force the price of oil sky high, and then the world will not be particularly pleased with the Israelis for having done so. So they have to think about that. I think one area that it's going to get a lot of chatter between now and whenever the Israelis carry out that strike is nuclear sites. How do you justify attacking Iran without taking out those nuclear sites, given what Israel has been talking about for the last decade and a half and warning about the proliferation of Iranian nukes, especially as they're only weeks away from a dash to a bomb should they choose to? And then comes to your last question, which is, what about those leaders? And there, I think it's interesting. The Israelis have not targeted legitimate leaders. I'm not saying that necessarily that Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, is legitimate, but he's the internationally recognized leader of Iran. The Israelis have always taken out terror leaders, right? So Hassan Nasrallah and Ismail Haniyeh and decapitation strikes in the Gaza Strip for a very long time. I mean, dating back to the Second Intifada, they were doing this. And so I'm sure there is a temptation. The question is, does this violate their rule or rules of engagement in terms of decapitation? And then, there's the other question, which is very Israeli. It's a rule, but maybe rules are meant to be broken, aren't they? And I would guess that this is something right now that the Israeli leadership is considering. They're mulling this now. I mean, I had a contact of mine telling me about how as the Israeli War Cabinet and their advisors went down into the pit, as they call it, at the Kiryat, Israel's Pentagon in Tel Aviv, that everyone was acutely aware of the fact that this was probably one of the most consequential meetings
Yeah.
since the lead up to the 1967 war. When you start to think about what Israel might do in response to that ballistic missile attack and the kind of damage that they may be able to inflict upon their mortal enemy in Tehran.
Yeah, and people have called it Israel's second war of independence.
It
Indeed.
is. I mean, if you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Israel sustained a multi-front assault. It was, I think, seven fronts
Hmm.
in 1948 and 1949. Today, you're seeing the same thing, seven fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, West Bank, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Iran itself. They are taking incoming from all sides, and I think the myopic view that Israel's fighting a war in Gaza against the Palestinians, I think it may play well on campus. It may play well, for some in the media, but I think if we're going to be realistic about it, this is a multi-front war being led by Iran on seven fronts, and you could even broaden out, Stephen. And I think this is lost on a lot of people too. The Iranian regime is in a close alliance with both the Russians and the Chinese.
Hmm.
And these are two regimes that are also looking to overturn elements of the US-led world order. We would call them the axis of aggressors, if you will. And there is an alliance of democracies, three, I think vulnerable democracies: Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel. And then there's this question of the rest of the West. What are we doing to support these embattled democracies? And I think that's kind of, I think we need to keep an eye on the horizon here right now. This is a tumultuous time. There is conflict that is breaking out across the globe. It's not a world war, and I don't want to be alarmist about
Hmm.
this, but we have a lot going on here right now, and there's a lot at stake. And I think that we need to be careful about describing this war as a war between Israel and the Palestinians or a war between Israel and Hamas. It's bigger than that already, and I think the Iranian attacks on October 1st certainly, I think, clarified that. But looking at the way that Hezbollah has been fighting Israel since October 8th, I think that was clarifying. The Houthi attacks, I think that, and how they've shut down the 12% of the world's maritime trade in the Red
Yeah.
Sea. That's big too, right? There are a lot of big things happening here. So I think, just broadening out those lenses, I think it's really, really important right now.
Right. And I always like to leave on a high optimistic note. So, final question. What do you like most about doing your FTD Morning Brief podcast?
Well, I got to tell you, I did not want to do it when I first started it. I was
Really?
just, well, what happened
Jonathan,
was,
you're
is
such a natural at it.
well, thank you. I like it now. I do. It's exhausting. I'm sure you know what that's like trying to
Yes, I
plan,
do.
and I do it three times a week, so it's
Yes.
like, whoa. It feels like a marathon. But what happened was is that I was giving the same briefing to multiple journalists and Hill staffers and other folks every morning, starting at like 6 o'clock in the morning, all the way until 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. And I was thinking, maybe I should just do this once, just once, right? Not six times, not seven times, not eight times. So I said, oh, let's try this. And as I did it, I began to find that there was an audience out there, people that were hungry for a half hour of news in a way that I think they wanted the news to be presented,
Yes.
right? A bare bones, clear with a perspective, of course. And I fully admit that I've got one. But then what happened from there is, our communications team said, "Well, you're recording this on video. Why don't you do Instagram Reels?" And I said, I don't really know what those are. I mean, I'm 52 years old. That's a bit beyond where I'm supposed to be in this stage of life. But what it's done is it's created sort of a little cottage industry
Yeah.
of videos and people that tune in live and people that tune in after, and it's on YouTube. And the impact has been great. The number of people that I've met have been amazing. The number of people that I've met who, where I'm giving a speech somewhere in middle America and they say, I love your program. It
Yeah.
feels really good right now because I think people are starving for information. And
Yeah.
so thank you for asking. It's really been a kind of a labor of love, and never thought I'd say, oh, I do a podcast, but I guess I do.
Welcome to the club. That's all I can say. But you fill in the gaps, I will say, with knowledge and information, not only you, but also your guests. So really congrats and just keep it going. I recommend it to everybody. So again, everyone in earshot, once again, you have to subscribe to FDD Morning Brief with Jonathan Schanzer. And indeed, Jonathan, we're going to leave it right there. We hope to have you on before the next anniversary of October 7th, indeed. And we hope by that time Israel is at peace. Of course, all the hostages are released and safe and sound. But we want to thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of the show. And we will see you soon. And of course, we will hear you on your podcast. So thanks once again.
Thank you.
All right. And we'll have info about Jonathan on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. We do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. We're releasing this one, of course, on Monday, October 7th for obvious reasons. But just so you never miss an episode, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Simply search for IsraelCast. It's that easy. And don't forget to rate and review us because it makes it easier for more folks around the world to find us. You can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website, once again, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And it takes a whole shop to put this show together, let me tell you. And we do want to thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, JD Krebs, and Ellie Cadrin for all of their help. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios right here in the very heart of New York City. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us, I'd love to hear from you, and I know Jonathan would as well. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning into this special October 7th edition of IsraelCast. Let's pray for peace, and Am Yisrael Chai.